If someone is serving a lifelong prison sentence, chances are they've done something pretty bad. While it might be difficult to picture someone who is old enough to be a grandparent as a criminal, the sad reality is that many inmates are senior citizens, especially in the United States. Regardless of how you may personally feel about jailing anyone over 65, all of the people on this list committed punishable crimes. In today's video, we will show you 10 people who outlived insane prison sentences. Number 10. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby, February 1886 to May 18, 1987. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby, like a few of the others on this list, served one of the longest prison sentences ever in the world. His record has been surpassed by Francis Clifford Smith, who is also on this list and still in jail. Grigsby spent over 66 years in jail after he was convicted of second-degree murder in 1908. There are some conflicting stories over what exactly happened when Grigsby stabbed a man named James Brown to death in a saloon over a card game. Regardless of who instigated the fight that led to Brown's death, Brown, who was white, reportedly hurled racial slurs at Grigsby, who is African American. Grigsby got a life sentence. In jail, Grigsby was a model prisoner and spent his time reading the Bible. Unfortunately, Grigsby spent a large part of his time in jail under psychiatric observation in a ward for the criminally insane, despite never exhibiting signs of mental illness. After his release at age 89, Grigsby's story was covered by the media, and Johnny Cash even wrote a song about him called Michigan City Howdy Do. Number 9. Charles FOSSARD, 1882 to 1974. Charles FOSSARD, a French immigrant living in Australia at the time of his crime, is not only one of the oldest prisoners ever, but FOSSARD also holds the records for longest prison sentence ever served. FOSSARD was locked up in the J ward of Ararat Lunatic Asylum for nearly 71 years before he died at the age of 92. In 1903, FOSSARD was convicted for killing a man named William Ford in his own home in Skye, Australia. Initially, FOSSARD was only charged with vagrancy when he was picked up by police 30 miles from the scene of the crime. The police were able to track FOSSARD down because he had stolen Ford's boots, which had a unique sole pattern. FOSSARD, who was only 21 years old at the time, was declared insane and spent the rest of his life in J ward. Before proceeding further, please subscribe to the channel and click on the notification so you can get notified when we upload the next video. Number 8. Howard Christensen, 64 years. Howard was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of a teacher in 1937. He was 16 years old at the time that he murdered a teacher. He committed this crime alongside a 17-year-old who was also caught for the crime. That person was also sentenced to life in prison, but they hung themselves back in 1943, just 6 years after being sentenced. About 30 years into the prison sentence, the sentence was changed from life without parole to 200 years in prison. But in 2001, after serving 64 years, he was released from prison, but just 2 years later, he passed away. Number 7. Theodore SYPNIER, 1909 to December 2010. Before his death in late 2010 at 101 years old, Theodore SYPNIER was the oldest American prisoner. SYPNIER was a pedophile who had a long history of sexually abusing children. His first conviction was in 1987, and unfortunately, he was only given 3 years probation for sex abuse. The first time SYPNIER actually went to jail was in 1994, but again his sentence was short, and he only served 1 year for sexually abusing a minor. SYPNIER's last conviction was in 2000 after he committed violent sexual abuse on 2 young sisters the year before. In 2009, despite several objections from judges, prosecutors, and anyone that knew him, SYPNIER was released to a halfway house. SYPNIER was returned to jail a few months later after he showed no remorse or intentions to change his ways. According to Reverend Terry King, executive director of Grace House, the halfway house SYPNIER was staying at, SYPNIER remained adamant that he was going to continue his behavior of molesting children. As a father myself, I'm glad to see him back in jail. Number 6. Bill Wallace, 1881 to 1989. Like many of the old prisoners on this list, Bill Wallace's long sentence was due to being deemed criminally insane. Wallace spent 63 years in the J ward of Ararat Lunatic Asylum, which maximum security psychiatric ward for Australia's most mentally disturbed and dangerous men. Wallace's story is a little unconventional, and technically he was never actually charged with a crime or went to court. In 1926, Wallace was arrested after he was suspected of killing a man at a cafe in Melbourne. Wallace refused to answer any questions and was declared insane by doctors, since he was unfit to plead. Wallace was sentenced to be held a Jew ward by the governor, who had the power to hold Wallace as long as he wanted. For whatever reason, Wallace never talked to the doctors about the crime and was never released. On his 100th birthday, the public petitioned to have Wallace released, and while the Australian government eventually agreed, Wallace was the one who refused to leave Jew ward. Wallace reportedly said, "Don't be fucking silly, I live here." Number 5. John BUNZ, 1919 to December 17, 2013. Although John BUNZ was sentenced to nearly 18 years in prison, he was only in jail for a few years as he died at the age of 94. Senior citizens do not often end up in prison, but BUNZ landed in jail after he murdered his 89-year-old wife in early 2010. BUNZ hit his wife in the head 30 times with a hammer and pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter. Before murdering his wife, BUNZ had been a law-abiding citizen, and his sudden turn to violence will always remain a mystery. After he realized what he had done, BUNZ attempted to commit suicide. Police reports show that BUNZ had struggled with depression and had attempted to kill himself twice before. BUNZ spent his time in jail bedridden in the medical unit of Wend Correctional Facility before he died in late 2013. Number 4. Francis Clifford Smith, September 1, 1924 to present. Until 2020, Francis Clifford Smith was the oldest living prisoner still in jail. However, according to a Connecticut-based news site, Smith was moved to a nursing home and paroled. Smith is serving a life sentence at the Osborne Correctional Institution for murdering a night watchman named Grover Hart on July 23, 1949. At the time, Smith was only 24 years old and has now spent almost all of his adult life behind bars. The details of the murder are not clear, and Smith may not have actually fired the weapon that killed Hart. Smith had 2 accomplices. Despite this, Smith was initially sentenced to death, but narrowly managed to have his sentence changed. Smith already had his head shaved in preparation for the electric chair. In 1967, Smith escaped for 11 days when he was being transferred to a minimum security prison farm. Smith was recaptured and had remained out of the news until he was semi-released in 2020. Number 3. Howard Christensen, 64 years. Howard was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of a teacher in 1937. He was 16 years old at the time that he murdered a teacher. He committed this crime alongside a 17-year-old who was also caught for the crime. That person was also sentenced to life in prison, but they hung themselves back in 1943, just 6 years after being sentenced. About 30 years into the prison sentence, the sentence was changed from life without parole to 200 years in prison. But in 2001, after serving 64 years, he was released from prison, but just 2 years later he passed away. Number 2. Richard HONECK, 63 years and 1 month. At the age of 22 years old, Richard was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of a former school friend. Life in prison sentence usually varies, depends on where you live in the world. Also, it can depend what state or city you are in as well. I know the states has different laws depending what state you're in. Some places even has a 3-strike law, meaning no matter what crimes you committed, as long as you're convicted of a felony, you will be served with a life sentence. So for Richard, he was paroled after serving 63 years and 1 month. He was released at the age of 85 years old. Number 1. Paul GEIDEL, April 21, 1894 to May 1, 1987. Until someone else breaks his record, Paul GEIDEL currently holds the record for longest prison sentence served in the United States and was even put into the Guinness Book or World Records. GEIDEL was in prison for over 68 years and had to be convinced to leave. He was granted parole in 1974, but didn't want to be released. GEIDEL, who was orphaned at age 7 and 17 years old at the time of his crime, murdered William Jackson, a resident of an apartment hotel that GEIDEL had briefly worked at. What are your thoughts about these criminals? Thanks for watching.